Welcome to the Hope for Parents with Struggling Teens podcast. My name is Brittany Johns. My hope with this podcast is that I can touch on relationship and mental health issues in a way that is more helpful than some of the resources out there, and that we can weed out some of the unhelpful trends in the industry of mental health and figure out what really works in fixing our relationships and the stuff that doesn't feel so good going on in our heads. The Inspired Resolution Center is dedicated to helping families with teens, so I'm going to talk a lot about teen mental health, parenting, and of course, the different family relationships that go on in families with teens. In this episode, we've got Brittany Johns once again joining me. I always love having you. We're going to talk about new diagnoses and misdiagnoses. And this episode comes from an interesting conversation that we had where, what did they say? You had a mom tell you what?
Yeah, so we have tons of phone calls that come in for regular kind of consults and putting people into appointments. And I've heard multiple times the phrase that we're going to talk about tonight come up. So we wanted to bring it to light and just give some feedback from how we interpret it from being in the arena of therapy. But it's been coming up a lot in the calls that...
Yeah, so what is it though? What is the phrase? I know neither one of us likes saying it. What is it?
School avoidant.
School avoidant. All right. And the conversation we had reminded me of some conversations we've had about misdiagnosis. And we often get ADHD that we believe is misdiagnosis, even though we can't really touch it once it comes in. Anxiety, depression, right? That's a whole nother episode. But to get a brand new diagnosis, we're going to call it a pseudo diagnosis, blew our mind, right? And so it's people, parents especially, starting to say that their child is school avoidant and they treat it as though it's some diagnosis. Not a diagnosis, but that's how they speak about it, as though they need help. And it brought up to me, and I don't know if you ever had a supervisor. We were a supervisor at one point, and he had supervisors before me, but one of my supervisors way back, and we're talking 2007, I think, told me he predicted that insurance companies' involvement in diagnosis is going to ruin mental health care, period. And I think that we are seeing that today, right? You can't get help unless you give a diagnosis. Therefore, the entire world is trying to jam people into these boxes that they don't necessarily fit in. And then you've got these up and coming therapists who are just kind of going along with it, right? We've had therapists working for us where we're going that's not the diagnosis. That's not correct. But they're adamant that it has to be. And so it's become this predicament. But so misdiagnosis is one thing, but creating new diagnoses, look, diagnoses are going to be created, but this is mind blowing, right? School avoidant. And there's this whole group of people who are pushing for that to be a diagnosis. And I actually believe that is a dangerous catchphrase. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. Because it's not something that once you're in that school avoidant, quote unquote, then the kids are picking up on that. Parents are latching onto that. You're getting into the whole insanity of chasing that rabbit hole. And so it's just, it's very dangerous.
I think it's dangerous because what it says that somehow the average person is not avoidant to not just school, but hard work. And I don't know about you, but I think that this whole idea, this concept that we've been pushing for decades now, where you must just do what you love. You must always enjoy your life. I think that's leading in an inadvertent way to a lot of sadness and frustration and lack of contentment, which can sometimes feel like it's a mental health diagnosis, right? Because you feel down. But of course you're school avoidant. This pseudo-diagnosis describes most students since the beginning of time. And I remember being in school. I was a water polo player. And so most of the team would have been diagnosed with school avoidant.
Yeah.
There were 2 or 3 kids who loved school. They got straight A's. They wanted to study more than they wanted to play, right? But that's actually an anomaly, right? And so as soon as we start diagnosing things that are within the bell curve of normal behavior, I think that becomes dangerous. And I think that becomes something that makes it impossible to do quality care in the mental health profession.
Yeah. And you're giving teens, especially an unattainable misconception that you must love school and every day you must love it and you must go back the next day. So it's giving them that unattainable goal.
Yeah. It's not attainable. You're not going to like school. You're going to like pieces of it. You're going to love the social aspect of school one day and you're going to hate it the next because everybody's against you. You're going to get an A on a test and you were in the groove and you're going to feel good about it. But then you're going to fail a test or not get an A and you're going to struggle to study and you're going to hate it that day, right? And some kids aren't willing to do the work, so they aren't going to like school. They're going to be school avoidant. I'm not willing to do the work, therefore I am school avoidant. And I'm frustrated by the fact that diagnoses like ADHD have made it very common to have excuses to not do the work, right? I have this thing, therefore I'm not going to do the work. And I'm somebody who was diagnosed with ADHD before it was a thing. Therefore, I had to do more work. I had to work harder on school than my friends and colleagues. But now it's become this shift where, well, we need to excuse them. We need to accommodate them in a way that doesn't expect anything of them.
Right.
And that's dangerous, in my opinion. And then the result of these pseudo-diagnoses or in overdiagnosis, misdiagnosis, is that the individual, the teen, doesn't take accountability. They're especially not taking accountability for failing, right? We all fail. Have you failed?
Yeah, absolutely.
Have you ever failed a test?
Yes.
I failed so many darn tests. It's unreal. I didn't even want to go to college, but I decided to go to college and I failed miserably going to college. And once I pushed through that, I got another degree and another degree. And now I'm running a teen therapy center, right? But I had to fail. So I still keep failing. I mean, you know how many programs we've tried to start and we fail. And so we're eliminating that really important experience of failing sometimes when we overdiagnose. Sometimes it's not the diagnosis. It's not that there's an issue other than you're human and that you have downtimes and cycles are really a pain in the butt. And failure is part of that foundation for success. You work at Ho. You're pretty high up at Ho. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think you're doing your teen or your preteen or your child a disservice by not walking alongside them in failure because you're not prepping them for what real life isn't at all it's going to be like and learning to walk alongside them with, okay, you failed with that, like Brandon, you talk about all the time, but we're still going to go out to ice cream. It's not going to be failure linked to a consequence.
Mm-hmm. And that's the thing is that walking alongside your child while they fail, but not giving them the excuses for it.
Right.
Right. You're not going down that route. It's just, hey, for whatever reason, whether you didn't put in the work or you struggle more than the average person, you failed here. Mm-hmm. And I still love you. And you can still be a success. In fact, this failure might be the reason you are successful. Yeah. That message has been lost, and instead, I think more than ever before, when people can't perform or aren't willing to put in the work, we want to find a reason other than they just want to quit.
Yeah. And that's what I think we're trying to impart here too, is that there doesn't need to be a solution or a diagnosis. Parents can be in the season of allowing their kids to have failure, troubleshoot with them, model, and then continue to still love on them and walk alongside them.
I love that. And we were talking about that before. There are seasons of school. There are seasons of all aspects of our life that become difficult. And for some people, it's a short season. For some people, feels like a forever season.
Right.
And the season, just because you have seasons and cycles in life doesn't mean that every adverse feeling or experience should be diagnosed and labeled. Mm-hmm. Right? It should just be, hey, this is an adverse experience you're having. You're struggling right now, and struggling is good. It's okay. It's a part of living. It's a part of, again, being successful. I think there's two things going on. Number one, more than ever before, people have been almost taught that adverse experiences are bad. And I get it, that's kind of a weird thing to say. Adverse experiences feel bad. They aren't bad though. They're actually good a lot of the time. And I think that also we have been teaching several generations now that when you have that season of adverse experience, there must be something actually wrong. There must be an anomaly going on instead of, hey, this might be normal. And I know mental health hates the word normal, but I mean, this might be normal.
Yes.
Right.
Or the only way to cope with it.
Right. Right. And sometimes you can't cope in a way that feels good. Sometimes coping just means you experience the season.
Yes.
You build some moxie, right? You build some strength because you experienced that difficult season. And then a new season comes and you don't feel as bad. And then you have another season and you feel terrible.
Yeah.
But I just think that this over-diagnosing and then creating pseudo-diagnoses, these new diagnoses that aren't really diagnoses, they are perpetuating issues that teens especially are experiencing. And
prolonging the symptom of what we're seeing with a child acting out of not going to school. And then you're latching onto school avoidant and instead of exploring like what's about, is it a friend situation? Is it their appearance? You're just jumping towards that when you've discounted your teen or your child to be able to explain to you what's going on that's making them school.
Exactly. Yep. Yeah. And again, I was school avoidant.
It's okay.
It was a short day where they were showing movies. I was school avoidant. But you know what? When it was my final for science class, I was school avoidant. And there's another thing that we have to acknowledge that's going on. And it's not just about the schoolwork and the academics. There's also bullying and, feeling isolated. I think that there's probably a little bit more if not a lot, a bit more isolation going on in schools. And so I would rather acknowledge that rather than say school avoidant. I'd rather talk about what's going on. Because a lot of the teens that come in, their parents have no idea how much they're struggling socially, right? Their parents think they have a bunch of friends. And then I kind of peel back the layers and figure out, wow, this teen doesn't have any friends. In fact, they're alone at lunch, right? And when you experience that, you're not school avoidant. You're experiencing something that's really hard. You're experiencing isolation, right? And say, you're experiencing isolation. Let's talk about that. Is much healthier than, you're school avoidant.
Right.
Now, there was another concept that you and I were talking about, and that's a lot of the parents come in and their child's struggling with a mental health issue, or they're struggling socially, or they're struggling with defiance. And they say, he or she is a smart kid. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, we both hear that at least once or twice a week.
Oh, absolutely. And we have no doubt that your kid isn't smart, energetic, motivated, all the aspects, but it's a qualifying statement that is underneath the parents' insecurities, I feel.
I like that.
Needs to be neutered because your child's also hearing that too. And innately it's doing your kid a disservice.
Yeah.
And a parent just needs to say, hey, this is what my kid is experiencing without the qualifications of everything under, but he's smart but she's, a cheerleader or whatever it might be. It's like, okay, that's fine.
Recently, I had a parent come in and tell me how smart their child is. And they were latching on to some behaviors that were from the age of 4. And this is a teen now at the end of high school. And they had done anything but we're talking D's and F's and defiance and drugs. Not behaving well. And I'm on the bandwagon of, hey, don't call people back. I'm not saying it's a bad person. I'm sure he was a good person, but he was doing many wrong things. And the parents had a hard time setting boundaries and doing the things that they needed to do to walk alongside their child. Because sometimes walking alongside your child feels good or feels positive. Sometimes walking alongside your child is tough because you're having to set boundaries. And so they couldn't do the boundary thing, the boundary part of parenting, because they were stuck on way back when my child was really smart and they are a good kid. Well, that's great. they're not behaving well right now, and you are enabling. You are a part of the problem, not because you don't have enough love for your child, but because you're stuck on this idea of, but they're a smart kid. Great. They're smart. Smart people get addicted. Smart people get depressed. Smart people have anxiety disorders. Smart people can experience mental health disorders just like everybody else. They can also experience failure because of their unwillingness to work hard. They can also experience having anger management problems, or smart people can be abusive, right? So it's interesting when the parents of teens who are struggling really latch onto, but they're smart. And I think occasionally, if not a lot of times, that gets in the way of the parent being able to get the help that they need to walk alongside their child in a healthier way.
Right. And just to grieve their expectations.
I like that.
Because like Brandon, like you were saying, it could have been their childhood where they got over, quote unquote, got over something in a month. Your child might need a year, or that's a catastrophe at school where a boyfriend broke up with them could need a little bit more TLC than what maybe their mom or dad is expecting them to do. So just walking alongside them in the parents letting go of their expectations in the grief of their child not being what they intended.
Yeah. And I like that. We use that often. Sometimes parents have to grieve their fantasy. Sometimes they have to grieve the long season that their child was in that was easier to deal with and accept what's in front of them. Yeah, and I think that word is probably one of the most important pieces to helping your child is grieve your expectations, grieve your fantasies, grieve the relationship that you had with your child in the past so that you can be present. And so I love that. The other kind of interesting phrase or concept that we're hearing, you and I have both heard it from a couple different parents, is my child is medicating with video games. Well, I don't mean to laugh, but what? That's mind-blowing. That's a mind-blowing concept. That's such an enabling concept to hold on to. Your child's not medicating with video games. Video games are more enjoyable and they are triggering those processes in the brain that look like addiction to drugs. They are, social media, video games, television, laying on your butt, not doing anything is all more, it is easier and something that we can get addicted to, right? It has nothing to do with I'm medicating with video games. Well, no, you're avoiding responsibility. You're avoiding building relationships because building relationships is hard. You're avoiding the difficult parts of life, or you've gotten into really bad habits and you've become addicted to video games. But I don't like this whole concept of medicating with video games. And I know a lot of people listening to this are going to totally disagree with me. And there are therapists out there who are jumping on this bandwagon because if I were to tell you as my client, you're just medicating with video games, then that client's going to, oh man, this feels good. All right. This isn't my fault. And rather than me reflecting to you, hey, you are avoiding responsibility. You are choosing and are responsible for this behavior.
Right.
I mean, what are your thoughts on it?
And of course, it's an escape. It's linked. It's very predictable. Video games, any other addiction, but especially video games, kids have instant reward. They know exactly what they're going to expect. There's a lot of achievement associated with video games. There's a social component that's not good or bad, but there are those instant gratification parts of it. And just the time suck of video games gets away from teenagers because they don't innately, even some adults, don't have that time differentiation. And so time passes. But then again, it's another qualifying statement of medicating with video games instead of saying my kid's choosing to play video games to escape the world.
The world,
what's going on,
the things that we listed. And I think I'd be okay with it if it wasn't a perpetuation of this. I think that it is another concept that adds to this overdiagnosing and then creating new diagnoses,
Yes.
right? I mean, I hope that we don't open up the DSM-6 someday and see school avoidant personality disorder and medicating with video games, Z code or something, right? That would be really rough for me. I would struggle to see that.
I'm sure.
It might happen. I don't know. With this whole video games thing, like you said, it feels good. It is kind of the epitome of instant gratification. Yeah. And I think that video games, these companies who create these video games, they're brilliant. Mm-hmm. They have honed psychology better than therapists and psychiatrists.
Oh, absolutely.
But they're using it for money, and they're using it in not a nefarious way, because we've seen a lot of people who've created social interactions, and good does come from video games. But like anything, when it's too much, it's bad. But it's not medicating with video games. It's video game creators have honed that part of psychology brilliantly, and it's addiction.
Yeah, there's the same receptors that are operating off of the same neuroreceptors from drugs there's tons of studies that you can look up. You can see it exactly excites the same part of the brain. But yeah, it's definitely not medication.
No. And I think what they're referring to is, oh man, I'm medicating this issue that I have. And I get that. I could make that. I get that. I could make an argument for that. Mm-hmm. But I think it's more simple than that. It just feels good to play video games, especially if you keep playing video games. And as you play them, it feels more good to play video games. Mm-hmm. Right. And
like I said, you know what you're going to get with that. Right. If you take a leap of faith and go to a party or take a test and you fail it, that the unknown is also what makes people school avoidant.
Right. Now, the last concept we were going to talk about today is when teens with cognitive deficits, or adults even, with cognitive deficits don't fit the spectrum, right? The autistic spectrum. There's a lot of focus on that, but I think we've lost sight of the fact that there are people who have cognitive deficits that psychiatrists, therapists, doctors don't fully understand, right? We know that there's a deficit, and there's no good diagnosis for it. And so what's happening is they get shoved into a box. Mm-hmm. They have to be shoved into a box because insurance companies, otherwise you can't get reimbursement. Mm-hmm. But they get shoved into it. That's had a political effect, that has had a social effect, right? And so now there's all these diagnoses that politically and socially are trends. They're cool almost. And instead of acknowledging that, hey, this is an ADHD, this is an autism, but there is a cognitive deficit. This person's brain either got a physical trauma or was not developed correctly. And to say that is triggering for some people. I've talked about that in session and had parents just be irate almost, right? How dare you say that's the issue? And then not think that I know my job because I tell them this doesn't fit a diagnosis that I can find. And maybe I just need to know more about diagnosis in that moment. I don't know. But I think that there are physical cognitive deficits going on. And when I say physical, I mean the brain, again, was either traumatized or not developed correctly, that don't fit the DSM diagnosis. And I think that is leading, again, to overdiagnosis and misdiagnosis, which doesn't allow families and individuals to accept the reality of what's going on so that they can get the care that they need. Have you seen that? I mean, with your family?
And of course, the gray area and what we're here as pillars in therapy to be is that empathic person to talk about the grief of, gosh, we don't know what this is. We need a little bit more time. We need to consult with medical. We need to make sure we have psychiatry on board. But being okay to not, the whole premise of this podcast today is to talk about not jumping right into diagnosis before really making sure we've sat in the gunk of, gosh, we're not sure what this is. And being okay with that too, and empowering the client to be like, we're not sure what's going on with you, but I want to be able to help you gather some more symptomatology, talk about journaling, thought records, everything that we can gather so that we can give you a proper diagnosis instead of
or admit that we don't have a diagnosis to give you and we're going to treat the issues going on.
Right.
Right. And so sometimes I feel like the parent, and so we want people to take away a few things today. And one of it is parents. I think that parents need to stop the insanity of chasing diagnoses and looking for the perfect intervention.
Yeah.
Right. Getting help is a process. Getting help has seasons to it. Getting help is about planting seeds. And sometimes you're not with the right therapist, but the fact that you went and it was okay leads to the next one. Right. And it's about networking and it's about building. But I see so many parents almost thwarting the therapeutic growth and process because they are so obsessed with chasing diagnosis. And I think that we as professionals feed into that. And we are not just a part of the problem, we're the cause of the problem, I think. And I even had somebody a long time ago when I don't know. I have no clue. They came to me and they had heard that I was really good, right? They made me feel really good, right? Because I was highly recommended to them and they came in and I had all this pressure to tell them what was going on. And I said, I haven't a clue. And what they told me was, you're the first person to say that. I said, what do you mean? We're the only one that admits that he doesn't know what's going on. Everybody else had their opinions. And now we've got 5 different therapists and psychiatrists and doctors who gave different information. And it's so nice to hear that you don't know what's going on. And you're also telling us that even though you don't know what's going on, you're willing to work with us and help us. And I think that the arrogance of us professionals sometimes gets in the way of us doing good work. The second takeaway is allowing teens to fail while we walk alongside them. That is not something our society is holding as a value anymore. You know, it's not, hey, fail and grow. It's when you fail, let's figure out the reason. And I know that, well, when you fail, you should figure out the reason, but it's not like figure out the reason so that you can be accountable. It's what is wrong with you and how is it not your fault? Instead of just, hey, there might be something going on with you, but you made some decisions that led to this and it's going to be a lot of work. And while you do that work and while you're struggling, I'm going to walk alongside you. And I think that one of the most important messages we give to parents these days is spend more time walking alongside your child as they fail rather than enabling, dismissing, fixing, or yelling and getting mad.
Right. They're going to be much more inept to come to you the next time it occurs, or ask for your feedback, or yell. All those things. Yes, it's in parents' nature to repel that idea. Like when Brandon says, just don't parent, or just don't have a consequence, or, you know, you didn't do so well with your boundary. Like looking at your side of the street too as a parent of what you can do is important. And failure is part of life. So just being okay with that too is important to implement that in your parenting.
So the third takeaway I want, and it kind of feeds into everything I've already said, but let's stop participating in the excuses, false diagnoses, and overdiagnosis, right? Let's just make it important to recognize what's working and what's not, regardless of the reason. I'm not saying never talk about the reason, but I think a more important focus for our society right now, for us as professionals, is to focus on the things that are working for individuals and the things that aren't working for individuals, the things that are working for families and the things that aren't working for families. And I think that the simplicity in that, it doesn't feel good for therapists, right? Because we love the complex diagnosis and we love being the experts, but sometimes that complex theory and diagnosis doesn't matter. Sometimes you just got to figure out what's working.
Right. And keeping it simple and being honest and open with patients and clients too, and us as therapists, but not saying, not diagnosing if it's appropriate, but not also jumping right to it. And then parents or your clients going down that rabbit hole and then feeling like they're at a dead end.
Yeah. Yeah. And that happens a lot. We get a lot of people who come in and say, hey, we've seen all these people. We got all these. I've had as much as 5 or 6 diagnoses for one person. And when I was in school, I was taught that you rule out symptoms. You can't put one symptom over here and over here. And, this whole rule out thing seems to be lost in the art of diagnosis, but that's a whole nother discussion. But I like it. Keep it simple. Walk alongside your children and don't chase this diagnosis, right? I'm not saying it doesn't have a role, but I think it's more important to almost not just allow your children to fail, but almost celebrate it. It's kind of weird because if you start to not celebrate in a way that lets them be defiant, but hey, you got through that. That was such a difficult season for you and you got through that. Let's go celebrate that.
Yeah. Normalizing failure, I think, is huge. And also sharing as a parent when you failed so that your child doesn't think that, oh, my parent, you don't have to do too much self-disclosure at all. Like have your kid going out all night and be like, well, you did that, mom or dad. But I think just in that and sharing with your child, well, hey, that happened to me. And they're going to come back to you next Friday night when they possibly made the wrong thing. And that's going to feel good to you as a parent. It's going to feel great to them as your kid.
Yeah. So this whole, I guess, topic for our podcast today is such an interesting one. And I have a feeling that we're going to be talking about this more in the future, but I think that we've at least started the conversation today. And I hope that at least a few people out there maybe shift their mindset in a way that allows them to walk alongside their team.
Yes. And feeling the relief is going to help in this whole process of diagnosing and the season of where your child's at, and just the relief in taking it one day at a time, keeping it simple. And
Absolutely.
that's what we're asking to do.
Exactly.